and welcome. I'm Ari Lax, and this week in our continuing modern content setup, I'm going to be bringing you the deck that I played at Grand Prix Indianapolis last weekend, which was Red Green Through the Breach, as tuned by fellow East West Bowl member Scott Lipp, who ended up finishing in the top 4 of the tournament with the deck. Um, this is the list that he played, which is slightly different than the one I played, but within a couple cards. So just going to go with his list because I actually liked a lot of the changes he ended up going with over the course of the event. Just kind of learned a couple things, and he probably already knew those and made the decisions correctly. But the list is really solid and a good starting point, regardless of what small tweaks you make. So to go over it, basically you're just pretty all-in deck in terms of just your plan is to cast a Primeval Titan or some other big threat and win the game. What sets this apart from the previous red-green decks that were Scapeshift oriented is that you have Through the Breach, which makes you a lot more aggressive. If you cast Through the Breach and you put a Primeval Titan out of the battlefield, finding 4 lands and attacking with a 6/6 is usually around 18 damage plus multiple Valakuts on the battlefield. So usually it's lethal or almost nearly it. Often, probably about 30% of the time, it is just literally like 18 damage on the attack trigger. So it's pretty crazy. And you might notice that, the other card you associate with Through the Breach is Emrakul the Aeon's Torn. You're a bit light on that here because you're overloading on Summoner's Pact, because finding Primeval Titan is just so much better than having Emrakul in your deck. You can Summoner's Pact for Primeval Titan, just cast the Titan. So that's like a really huge addition. You do need this critical mass of 8-ish targets to make Through the Breach worth it, but I don't think you want to overload on Emrakul's, just because the card Emrakul is just a stone blank. Looking at our last threat, it's a Scapeshift. This wasn't even in the deck up until pretty close to the Grand Prix. This kind of needed an additional threat. We ended up adding a Scapeshift just as it's not optimal, and we'll kind of go through why in a second. The immediate thing you might notice is there's only 25 lands in the deck, and usually Scapeshift decks have moved up to the 26, 27 range. So it's not always going to hit for what you need it to, but it still gets the job done if the game goes a little longer. And usually you only need the second threat against decks that are playing an attrition game, and Scapeshift is game over in those matchups. Looking at the lands real fast because that's important. Only 3 Valakut the Molten Pinnacles. Unlike the other Valakut, the Scapeshift deck, you don't have like Colony Heart Expedition, so you're not necessarily going to natural Valakut people out as easily. So you only need the 3 that you end up finding with Primeval Titan. The third usually, it gets found for those 18 damage on the attack trigger, so you have all 3 Valakuts and you attack, and you get your 2 mountains, and you trigger each Valakut twice, so that's 18 damage, 3 times 6. So that is why there's the third, is for that setup, and also in case one of them gets destroyed, it's hard to chip shot your opponent away with 1, but if you can find another one, so you have 3 for that reason. And there's 12 mountains, which has been pretty solid. Only 2 Cinderglades. It's the best land to have late, but you never want to draw it in your opening hand, so there's only 2. You fetch for it a lot later on. 4 Stomping Grounds, just, you need as many green sources as possible, and this is the free roll. Cinderglade, on the other hand, makes you play your spells a turn late sometimes, which is bad. And then 6 actual mountains. This is about the bare minimum you can get away with. Then you have your Accelerants. So the thing I would like to note is that the way this deck is configured, especially with Through the Breach, you want to be a lot more aggressive than the traditional Scapeshift deck is. You want to be jamming, turn 3, turn 4, sometimes you can kill on turn 3 realistically with like Search for Tomorrow on 1 into Secure Traveler or Farseek on 2, and you just breach and they die a lot of the time. Because at that point you can have 4 mountains, 5 mountains even, get 2 Valakuts, and then 18 them. Yeah, it's quite powerful in that sense. So Simian Spirit Guide comes in for these jumpstart aggressive kills. You're not overloading on 4 because you do want the other acceleration more, because it actually puts mountains on the battlefield for Valakut. But this card is very good in this deck, and another reason why the Scapeshift plan doesn't work well. And the other reason, too, is that Through the Breach and Scapeshift aren't really good friends. Scapeshift wants every one of your cards to convert to a land, and then you cast Scapeshift after putting them all on the battlefield. And sometimes you just draw like Through the Breaches, and those aren't lands. Moving to the spells, you'll also notice, again, another reason Scapeshift is worse is because your spells actually put you down a card. A lot of the best Scapeshift decks I've seen have been mostly based on interaction that puts you back up a card, like Electrolyze and Remand and Cryptic Command, so that you can ensure that you hit the 7 necessary or 8 necessary lands, whereas the red-green list just can't do that. Again, this is why Colony Guard Expedition is so important in the Scapeshift list, because it gives you a 2-for-1 that provides lands. So you've got a bunch of Lightning Bolts, best way to slow people down. A couple of Anger of the Gods, which it's been okay. It's not amazing, but it does the job. A couple Obstinate Balos. Powerful card on a lot of axes. It interacts with Liliana out of Jund, interacts with Burn very well, which is one of the harder matchups. Really, we'll get to that in a minute, but any of the decks that are kind of linear can be a little difficult at times. Baloth really helps there. You can also Summoner's Pact for it, which is a pretty big plus. Having multiples game 1 is pretty huge. And of course, are just for value that just gets you to places. The card that Robert Pisano played in his second place list was Pia and Kiranalar. I would not be opposed to trying one or two of those. Courser is probably the worst card in the deck, and that's where I'd start to cut. But I don't think that card's amazing, but it does do good work against some of the Infect and Affinity draws, and then again, those are matchups that you might need a little more interactive help against. So moving to the sideboard and talking a little bit about matchups. So the list that I played was 3 cards different, and it was those 3 right there. I had another Anger of the Gods and 2 Beast Withins, but Beast Within was fine. I didn't mind it. I think Crumble accomplishes a lot of what I want Beast Within to accomplish, honestly, though. I mean, Beast Within's a nice... Beast Within has extra value against Planeswalkers like Nahiri the Harbinger, a Johnny Vengeant, but realistically, the most important thing for it to do is to just KO Tron by destroying their land or something like that. And Crumble to Dust does that, and it's also just as fine against, as a Stone Ring against random combo decks, only you can't get, beat down because they have a 3/3. And the Scapeshift, just as another threat against the fair decks, is great, especially because against counter spells, you board down on Simian Spirit Guides, and you just end up with this deck that is functionally more land dense in terms of how it plays. Even though you have the same number of lands, the way you have to play your hands and everything plays more towards a Scapeshift setup. Let's see. We got Ancient Grudge for Affinity, pretty obvious. Again, a tough matchup. The thing is, you're very non-interactive, and that's kind of how this deck works. You're assuming that the reason this deck is good at any time is that you're almost as fast as the Tier 1 fast decks, but you're doing so via Primeval Titan, which is a card that doesn't die to Abrupt Decay, Lightning Bolt, most of the traditional hate cards. What you're trying to do is you're trying to dodge those and hope that your opponent doesn't have the right hate cards for you, which we'll talk about in a minute. Or in the wrap-up, sadly, there are ways to fight the strategy heads up. So you have, Ancient Grudge to cover the Affinity weakness. There's not additional Angers. I thought they were really good going to the tournament, but playing more, I think that the movement away from Obzon Company towards Eldritch Evolution decks makes this card a lot worse against the green creature decks. And I think that a lot of the other creature decks you kind of just stomp with Primeval Titan. So it's not as important as it used to be. So I think that only 3 Anger of the Gods is fine. Another Obstinate Baloth against Burn, just another thing you can put in against Jund and their Lilianas. A Reclamation Sage, most importantly, this deck is kind of soft to Blood Moon. You can beat them with a Primeval Titan through it, but it's kind of obnoxious at times. Same with Leyline of Sanctity or Ruined Halo. So you do have a Summoner Pactable way to destroy an enchantment or artifact there. A Malira, this is your hate card against Infect that you can find with Summoner's Pact. And then your Artifact Hate. So you got Grafdigger's Cage. Handles a lot of combo decks, the Creature Search decks, Reasonable and Snapcaster Mage decks that you don't want any kind of removal against. Some Engineer Explosives to mop up the Death Shadow Zoo decks and other aggressive creature decks in ways that Anger doesn't really work. You can't kill a Death Shadow with an Anger of the Gods most of the time. And then Chalice is your really generic anti-unfair card. Not as good as it should be against Burn and stuff, but just takes out a lot of random things. So, to talk about the things that I don't want to play against, the Crumble to Dust is a card you can play around pretty easily, actually. I was pretty impressed with the ability to just, your first Primeval Titan trigger gets fetch lands, and then, you can just put 2 Valakuts on the battlefield, sack your fetch lands, and kill them pretty easily. I was not happy playing against a high density of Fulminator Mages. It's just kind of obnoxious. Surgical Extraction on top of Fulminator Mage was also pretty annoying, especially if there's ways for them to, get a Titan into your graveyard and surgical it. It gets pretty hard to win. Blood Moon effects are pretty obnoxious. Fast clocks are obnoxious. Oddly, the discard effects aren't that great. They're like the thought seizes are fine, but you have a pretty critical density of threats, so that's okay. And I just kept a lot of Inquisition of Kozilek proof hands. I literally kept like 5 lands, Obstinate Baloth, Scape Shift against Jund in one game because I knew they just would like keep an Inquisition hand X% of the time, and they did. And their hand was like Inquisition, Inquisition, Liliana, and there's like, oh no, I can't do anything with any of my cards, and they just almost immediately lost the game on turn one when they saw that hand. So yeah, hopefully we don't run into a lot of hyper-aggressive decks, but I think the Grand Prix metagame was relatively fair. I looked around and saw a lot of Jund and Obzon and things like that this deck has pretty solid game against. And I'm kind of, it's just fun to play. It's a good quick play, and I'm pretty excited to just get more games in. It's legitimately a very fun deck in Modern.